Every president who ever sat in the Oval Office brought something personal into the White House with them. Their politics, yes, but also their food, the comfort meals they asked for when the day was finally done. I am Walter, and this is American Food Memories. Subscribe if you are new here, and stay with us today, because the food these men kept close tells a story about America that most history books leave out. From Washington's Hoecakes to Reagan's jelly beans, this one goes all the way back. George Washington. George Washington grew up in colonial Virginia, and the food he loved reflected that world entirely. Martha Washington ran a serious kitchen at Mount Vernon, and one of the dishes Washington returned to again and again was Hoecakes. These were simple cornmeal pancakes cooked on a griddle, served hot with butter and honey, often eaten at breakfast before the day's work began. He ate them before he was president, and he ate them after. They were plain, practical, and deeply American before that phrase meant anything official. Washington also had a fondness for cream of peanut soup, a dish common across the Virginia Tidewater region in the 18th century. It was a thick, warming bowl made from peanuts ground into a paste, chicken broth, and cream. Neither of these dishes appears on many menus today, but the man who led the Continental Army asked for Hoecakes and peanut soup, and that tells you more about where he came from than any portrait ever could. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson spent years in France as a diplomat, and the food he encountered there changed what Americans ate for generations after he returned. He came back with a deep enthusiasm for French cooking and a determination to bring dishes to the White House table that most Americans had never seen. Jefferson is often credited with helping introduce macaroni and cheese to the United States after encountering pasta dishes in Europe and having a pasta machine shipped back home. He served versions of it at White House dinners in the early 1800s, long before it became the American staple it is today. He also brought back a love of ice cream and served it at formal dinners when very few American households had ever tasted it. Jefferson grew a kitchen garden at Monticello with more than 300 varieties of vegetables. The man who wrote about the pursuit of happiness also spent considerable energy thinking about what would be on the table. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln came from a childhood with very little. He grew up in log cabins in Kentucky and Indiana, and the food of those early years was basic frontier cooking. What he loved as president reflected that plainness completely. Lincoln was especially fond of chicken fricassee, a dish of chicken pieces braised slowly in a creamy pan sauce thickened with flour. It was hearty, simple, and the kind of meal that felt like home after a long and difficult day. He had eaten gingerbread cookies since he was a boy, and he kept asking for them in the White House, the same as he always had. Mary Todd Lincoln was known as an accomplished cook and made sure the table reflected the president's honest tastes alongside the demands of formal entertaining. Lincoln never asked for elaborate food. He asked for food that fed people and tasted like somewhere he belonged. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt brought an enormous appetite to the presidency in every sense of the word. He was well known for eating large quantities at every meal and for his general enthusiasm for meat. Roosevelt was also a devoted coffee drinker and consumed it in quantities that concerned everyone around him. Every account of Roosevelt's eating says the same thing. He approached food the way he approached everything, completely and without slowing down. He liked game, beef, and generous portions. Formal White House dining existed on his schedule, but Roosevelt himself was always most comfortable at a table with plenty on it and no need to slow down. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt led the country through the Great Depression and the Second World War, two of the hardest stretches in American history. In 1939, when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth of Britain visited Hyde Park in New York, Roosevelt served them hot dogs at a picnic on the lawn. He knew exactly what he was doing. American food on American terms, with no apology for it. Roosevelt loved the simplicity of hot dogs and served them again and again over the years. He also had a taste for simple scrambled eggs and kept his meals plain throughout his years in office. Eleanor Roosevelt, famously, had little interest in cooking, and the White House table during their long tenure reflected that. Practical food for a practical time. These meals were never just about food. For families living through the Depression and the war years, food was the daily measure of whether things were going to be all right. Harry Truman. Harry Truman was from Missouri, and he never forgot it. His food preferences were as plain and direct as his reputation. Truman loved fried chicken, hot dogs, and country ham, the kind of food that would have been on any working family's table across the Midwest in the 1940s. He was also fond of a good piece of pie and ate simply throughout his presidency without any apology for it. Bess Truman ran a frugal White House kitchen, reportedly watching the budget carefully and resisting any move toward elaborate or expensive entertaining. The Trumans ate at the family table the way ordinary American families did, with honest food, cooked well, and no pretension about it. Harry Truman remains one of the few presidents whose eating habits would have looked completely at home at a kitchen table in Independence, Missouri, which was exactly the point. Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was one of the few presidents who could actually cook, and he took real pride in it. He was especially known for his beef-vegetable soup, which he made himself on weekends, starting with a beef shank and building the broth slowly from scratch, the way his mother had shown him. He also made his own cornmeal pancakes and grilled steaks over charcoal on the White House roof on Saturday afternoons. Eisenhower also had a strong fondness for peach ice cream. The image of a five-star general in an apron standing over a charcoal grill on a Saturday afternoon is one of the more human pictures of that presidency. Eisenhower said he found cooking meditative, and meant it. For a man who spent his career giving orders to armies, the kitchen was a place where he could simply cook. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy grew up in a wealthy Massachusetts family, and his food preferences never drifted far from New England. He was deeply attached to New England clam chowder, the creamy, milk-based version that Boston had been making for generations, and not the tomato-based Manhattan version that New Englanders considered a fundamental misunderstanding of the dish. Kennedy ate clam chowder regularly throughout his presidency, and it appeared at White House dinners. He also liked fish chowder, broiled chicken, and Boston cream pie. His wife, Jacqueline, transformed White House entertaining into something more polished and formal than it had been in decades. But Kennedy himself was drawn to the simpler, regional food of his Massachusetts childhood. The clam chowder he asked for at the White House was the same bowl a working family might have had on a cold Tuesday evening in Gloucester, just made in a different kitchen. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson was from the Texas Hill Country, and the food he loved was Texas food without compromise. He was particularly devoted to chili, and his preferred version was a thick, meaty bowl with no beans, because in Texas in the mid-20th century, beans in chili were considered beside the point by many cooks who knew the dish. Johnson had his recipe prepared in the White House kitchen and reportedly sent copies to reporters who wrote about it. He also loved barbecue, venison from his ranch in the Hill Country, and the kind of slow-cooked, long-fire meat that was a staple of Central Texas cooking for generations. Johnson ate with real enthusiasm and in generous quantities, and he was not formal about it. He held meetings over meals and was known to eat at odd hours. When he hosted guests at the LBJ Ranch, the food on the table was Texas from the first bite to the last, whether the guests were senators, cabinet members, or foreign visitors. Something changes in the mid-20th century in how presidents related to food. The earlier ones ate what their region produced. By the post-war decades, food had become something more deliberate. The chili on Johnson's table said Texas. The clam chowder on Kennedy's table said Massachusetts. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's most remembered food habit was one of the stranger ones in presidential history. He reportedly ate cottage cheese topped with ketchup for lunch, often at his desk, with little interest in the meal as anything beyond something to get through so he could return to work. Nixon was not known for enjoying food particularly. He ate quickly and simply and kept his meals close to austere. He was also fond of meatloaf and of Triscuit crackers with canned tuna, both of which he could eat without stopping whatever he was doing. The cottage cheese and ketchup combination puzzled White House staff when it became public knowledge, but Nixon himself seemed entirely unbothered by the reaction. For a man whose presidency contained some of the most complicated events in American history, the lunch he asked for most often was something that cost less than $1 at any grocery store in the country. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan brought two food passions into the White House that became more recognizable than almost anything else about his personal life. The first was jelly beans. Reagan had taken up eating them years earlier as a substitute for his pipe, and by the time he reached the presidency, Jelly Belly had created a special blueberry flavor so Reagan could have a red, white, and blue selection for his inauguration in January of 1981. Jars of jelly beans sat on the table at cabinet meetings throughout both of his terms and became one of the recognizable images of that White House. His second passion was macaroni and cheese, which he asked for as a regular family dinner, something warm and familiar at the end of a long day. Reagan also loved brown sugar fudge and simple meals without ceremony when his schedule allowed for them. He came from modest beginnings in Dixon, Illinois, and the food he kept returning to never moved very far from that. The jelly beans may have been the trademark, but the macaroni and cheese is the one that tells you who he was before the cameras arrived. Every president on this list walked into the White House carrying the taste of the place they came from. Washington's Hoecakes from a Virginia morning, Truman's country ham from a Missouri kitchen, Kennedy's clam chowder from the New England coast, Reagan's macaroni and cheese from an Illinois childhood that had very little extra in it. The food did not make them presidents, but it made them human, and in a house that can feel very far from ordinary American life, the thing each of them reached for at the end of a long day was usually something plain that tasted like the place they came from. Leave a comment and tell me which president surprised you most, or tell me which one you would have liked to sit down and have dinner with. Subscribe if you are new here. This is American Food Memories, and we are glad you are here with us.